Hey, Michael, how are you doing?
Good. We're
It's so
live.
good to see
Sorry.
you.
We didn't actually do a 10, 9, 8 type countdown with our voices, but it's good to see you too. How are you?
Excellent. Pretty good. It's good morning for me and good evening for you.
I'm very excited. This live stream has been a long time in the making. I also haven't
Sure
done a
has.
live stream in a long time. But I'm really excited to have you here because this album is a project I feel very honored to be a part of. And the project is obviously much bigger than just the small parts I've contributed. But yeah, and I'm also very excited to interview you about it because I admire your writing a lot and your music as a composer and also you as a person. Um, so, what do you want to tell people about today's program, as it were, about this CD that you just brought out and why we're here on screen?
Well, thanks so much, Mike, first of all, for arranging all of this and for being part of the album. You have been part of it since the very beginning, since I first started thinking about making the album, and you were integral in commissioning a piece from the album and in performing another one in the album with me. So thank you for that.
You're
Um,
very welcome.
I think that this album for me is kind of a special coming out as a guitarist, not because I feel like I wasn't a guitarist before or and I was solely a composer, but I think all composers at some point they all start being musicians first and then they become composers and just stick to writing. So for me this is a little bit of an album in which I do both. And so I'm premiering sort of three works in the album itself. So it's kind of big since like a world premiere is kind of a big important deal for in the composer world, and this album
Hmm.
has you know three different pieces, and so I'm feel quite lucky to be able to put this out and be a performer in it. And I think I mostly did this as an excuse to be around other musicians performing and share credit with some amazing guitarists and good friend collaborators as well.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the album is what strikes me, and also some of the people I know who listen to preview copies of it is the breadth of styles and the ways in which you use. I mean, if you just look at it on the surface of it, that you write what we would traditionally some people would call quote unquote classical music, ensemble
Hmm.
music. But I know your work is much wider than that. But if you talk about guitar in that context, you think mostly just of classical guitar. But I admire so much how you've blended so many elements of electric guitar playing, and not just electric guitar in general, but so many different varieties of it, along with flute, with electronic music, with
Hmm.
classical guitar as well, with the piece that Nathan and I commissioned. It has a real breadth, but at the same time, the album has some very concrete themes. And when I've listened through it, some very concrete musical motifs and ideas and textures and even
Hmm.
harmonies that sort of span across the different pieces, which is I
Hmm.
think really special and quite an achievement, I have to say. But what is your view of the album style and concept as a whole? I mean, the title is sounds of time and distance. So how does
Hmm.
that all tie into looking at the album as a whole?
About like 3 months ago, I started listening to the album as a whole, and it struck me how different some of the genres were. So I'm glad you're pointing that out because there are sort of like, straight up classical music type of things that include dissonance and they include notation, and it's all based on music notation and a performance that somebody requires very specialized musical knowledge to take a look at the score and interpret it for me and play
Hmm.
it back. And then there's other pieces in there that I jammed with my band. We recorded them in the studio, and then later on, I took the stems from that piece and then I just reworked them into the remix that I put out on the CD. Some of the other stuff that I have in there that I included is a riff that I remember coming up with back in 1999 when I was studying in university in Missouri. And it just kind of stayed with me. And I decided to include it in this album because, it had a guitar and it's something that I found important because the through line, I think, in the whole album is this idea of time and distance and what time means and what distance means in the context of music. And to me, the genres or the different stylistic elements of each of these pieces, more than them being different from one another, they're still all a part of me in some kind of integral or significant way. And at different points throughout my life or my career, I've sort of relied on, you know, some of my skills as a person that likes working on a digital workstation, or as a person that improvises and then just notates what I improvise for other people to perform. So it all kind of came together when I was putting this thing together and learning the Steve Reich piece too as another integral kind of influence piece that has been in my life for a long time. So I think
Mhm.
even though it's all different multi-genres, I see it as a hybrid type of an album that incorporates all the different things that inform my practice in music listening and music writing.
Yeah, makes sense. Nice. Great. Yeah, I think it, yeah, again, I know I've already said it once, but it's truly an accomplishment how cohesive the album is, despite all the different, yeah, one could call them genres or styles and instrumentations on it. And I know you're a guitarist yourself. You play electric guitar. You play in a band, like you
Hmm.
mentioned,
Hmm.
which is also made up of, as far as I understand it, other composers as well, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but it's also, I know it's your maiden voyage writing for classical guitar in the piece that you wrote
yeah,
for Nathan and I. So I know that you still stepped out of your comfort zone in terms of approaching the guitar. And I know the piece you wrote for Mark and Adrian, who we're going to talk to in a moment, probably included
yeah,
stuff that you wanted Adrian to play.
yeah.
Um, and that maybe you wouldn't play yourself. I know, like, we'll talk a bit later about your struggle between your identity as a
Sure,
composer and guitarist, because I know that's a part of it, especially the Reich and stuff. So we'll come
totally.
back to all these themes about the album as a whole. I also
Hmm.
wanted to say to the audience, people who are watching, please feel free to ask questions. We're here, not just to talk about what we've prepared to talk about, but also anything you guys have to ask. I see my dad said hi from Spruce Grove. Hi, Dad. Nice to see you. Thanks for tuning in. And yeah, just leave a comment. Even if you don't have a question, leave a comment about your thoughts. We'd appreciate hearing what you think. And yeah, also, just quickly for people, in the video description, there should be links to Spotify and Bandcamp if you want to listen to the album on Spotify, or you want to buy it on Bandcamp and help support the album itself and Alfredo. That would be greatly appreciated. And also, if you want to just listen to the album later, the link will be there, so you can listen to it anytime after we've piqued your interest with all the pieces. So we're going to go through each piece in the album and talk a little bit about each one. First one I want to talk about is Wave Remote, which is not actually the first track on the album, but we're going to bring on two more special guests for this. We're going to bring on Mark Takeshi McGregor and Adrian Verdejo, the flutist and guitarist who recorded this piece. Do you want to quickly give us an intro on the concept of this piece, Alfredo, and then we'll bring them on?
Absolutely. The piece was written for flute and electric guitar in the spring of 2020. It was commissioned by the McGregor Verdejo duo. And in April of 2020, when I started in earnest writing this piece, the whole entire world had entered into this like lockdown period because of the pandemic. And, I could say more about that later. And the pandemic, I think it's going to be a bit of a, running narrative
Theme?
in our
Yeah.
conversation here because we're kind of still coming out of it.
Yeah.
But they have a duet that have been performing a lot of guitar and flute pieces. And one thing that we wanted to do with this piece was to have the guitar no longer play a background supporting instrument. Given that the guitar can play multiple notes at a time, it's
Mm-hmm.
usually relegated a more harmonic type of role. So we wanted Adrian to have a more of a foreground type of character. And because I knew that I was going to write for electric guitar, the idea was for the piece to be performed live too. And so because the guitar was going to be using a bunch of pedals, I wanted the flute to also be amplified and its signal run through all sorts of different pedals.
Okay.
So the piece has a lot of loopers and a lot of repeated sections that when the performer plays once, they record what they perform and then they play on top of each other, and
Mm-hmm.
that connects to some of the other pieces in the album. But there's a
Nice.
lot of long short-term gestures that create
Mm-hmm.
really tight loops, and then there's sections in the second movement that are entire passages of music where Adrian and Mark both play against the ghost of themselves of the very recent past.
Mm. Yeah, the loop.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and one quick thing I wanted to say about the piece and about its title is that it does allude a little bit to the use of foot switches and the use of pedals to alter characteristics of the sound as a sort of remote control, hence
Mm-hmm.
the title Wave Remote.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of also thought about it as like waving remotely to people since we were all kind of in isolation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even in nod to my former self, who used to play a lot of electric guitar growing up,
Mm-hmm.
before thinking of composition in earnest, this idea of using electronics to alter sound that occurred later on down the signal path was just always really interesting. So, Wave
Nice.
Remote is this kind of title that to me encapsulates and summarizes what I kind of envisioned for the piece.
Cool. Nice. Well, let's bring Mark and Adrian on now.
Sure.
Going to add them to the stream. This is my maiden voyage, by the way, everybody, with this in StreamYard technology. So you'll have to bear with me if things are a little clunky here and there. But let's add Mark and Adrian in. Hi, guys. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I'm very happy you're both here. This is a little bit of a reunion for me in some ways because I used to live in Vancouver. And I remember actually, Adrian, I don't know if you remember this, but the very first masterclass I ever played in as a guitarist was the Victoria Guitar Trio in Calgary. Like, it must have been more than a decade ago almost. So, and then I met you, Mark, as well in Vancouver through Alfredo when I was living there. So this is a little bit of a reunion. It's kind of nice for me to see familiar faces from the West Coast because I miss that part of Canada a little bit. You guys were listening in a little bit on our intro there, but I wanted to first ask you before we start looking at some excerpts from the piece, what was this piece and this project like for both of you as a process and as a duo? Is this idea of blending electric guitar and flute something you're both very practiced at, or have you usually played classical guitar in your duo together, Adrian? I don't actually know this about your experience together, but was this piece unique in its process at all for both of you, and what was it like?
Certainly, yeah. And just want to say thanks for having us. Also, Michael, it's great to see you again.
Yeah.
And I do remember that class some years ago, so it's great to finally catch up. And we miss you out here as well. So hope to see you in person sometime.
Sure.
Yes, Mark and I had been playing, I think, at that point for a few years together. Mostly, I was playing classical guitar for most of the pieces we had been playing for gigs, and also some of the earlier commissions. Alfredo was a mutual friend of both of ours, and both of us had played his music on separate occasions and local concerts. And Mark especially had commissioned some works from Alfredo for solo flute, I believe at least a couple works. And as Alfredo mentioned, we had kind of started talking about the piece and conceptualizing the piece, even kind of doing some early tech rehearsals and kind of seeing how the instruments would work, going through the pedals and the loopers and so forth. And yes, just right at that moment, in 2020, we entered the pandemic. Things sort of were delayed considerably, both for our duo, our plans. You know, we had these plans to go on tour. We're actually going to be playing the piece and going to Mexico to workshop the piece. And so all of that got sort of kicked down the road, which actually afforded us a little bit more time, I think, to refine some of the concepts on within the piece. Also, you know, working with Alfredo, we had done an earlier demo of some of the sketches of the piece as well, kind of sending it back and forth between the performers and the composer. Actually, because we were sort of semi-locked down, Mark and I, Mark had recorded his parts in his home practice studio. I'd recorded my parts here and sort of assembled them to sort of get an idea of how the piece would initially come together, which I think maybe offered some new insight for Alfredo to revise the piece. And then over the course of, again, almost maybe a year and a half or so, finally we produced the piece in the recording environment. It has not yet been premiered in a live setting, but we both are planning to do this at some point in the near future. So, yeah.
Yeah, the pandemic definitely made assembling these kind of things interesting. That was a similar experience for Nathan and I with our piece because we weren't able to see each other in person through the pandemic, being in separate countries. And yeah, for Mark, for you, what was it like the process of this? You play a few different flutes in this piece too, right? So what was the...
Yeah, I play piccolo and I play alto flute, which is a little bit less standard, I guess, in instrumentation for this sort of duo. I mean, Adrian really did say most of it. It was one of those things where, like, we had been working in a duo together for a few years, and we were one of our preoccupations as a duo is commission new works. And Alfredo is somebody whose music I've played a lot, and yeah, there was a solo flute piece that Alfredo wrote for me just before the lockdown, and it's one of my, I mean, we're not supposed to have like favorite children, but you know, we do.
Yeah.
So it really is one of those sort of special pieces. So it seemed like a natural choice to ask Alfredo to write for our duo, especially with Alfredo's background as a guitarist. And one of the things I love about this is, like, the flute guitar duo, it kind of has a not untrue stereotype of being sort of like focused on, say, folk music and, you know, classical
Piazzolla.
arrangements, Piazzolla, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah,
but,
of course. Yeah.
The idea of sort of commissioning new works was to sort of like blow that open and see what we could, see what else is there. And one of the things that I found the most interesting about this whole process, and I'd say sort of also slightly terrifying, is like, I know electric guitarists have like pedals are just sort of part of the game, but they're not something that I have very much experience with at all. So, we had a session early on, Alfredo and I, where we just tried out different pedals and loops and effects and things like this. And
oh, cool.
It was really wild because, I mean, it was interesting to see what would and wouldn't work, on the flute, but it was really cool to be able to actually assemble this, to sort of assemble the piece remotely to a certain degree, and then sort of have these effects, watch this piece sort of build with its effects and things like this, and understand that there's a whole world that was being conceived.
Yeah, definitely.
Was really outside of what we normally do.
Yeah, I think like a lot of things struck me about the piece. I think the recording is amazing, and you guys have achieved something truly special through the three of you all together working on it. But like what I noticed also is that the sustain of the electric guitar is really nice with flute, because with classical guitar and flute, a lot of the time the guitar can strum chords or try to artificially lengthen texture, but with electric guitar you can get such sustain, especially with the EBow, and then the flute and the guitar blend in this very different way. So I have to say I'd like to hear more music for electric guitar and flute now. In general, it's a very cool pairing. I was thinking we would listen now to a little excerpt, and I have some of the score to show people as well.
Sure.
So I have two excerpts, and I wanted to first put the music on the screen and ask both of you if you have any comments before we listen to it, for people to listen for something. The first excerpt is this one, which is from the first movement. And I chose this because, well, as Alfredo mentioned, the piece has like a lot of looping going on. So you can see at the top it says loops 1 and 2, which signifies that there's already a flute loop happening. And then you hear the electric guitar with the EBow, which maybe I'll let Adrian quickly explain what the EBow is and how he used it here, because I think it produces a very cool texture. And then Mark comes back in and adds even more flute with these notes here. So do either of you have things you want to explain or draw attention to before we listen to it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I happen to have my EBow right here. This is what it looks like, and it is an electromagnetic device. You can switch it on, and most of them have 2 modes to basically initiate different partials of the harmonic series on each string. So if you have steel strings, you can create infinite sustain if you so choose, and you can move it around. You can create some very interesting noisy effects as well. I've seen it used on pianos and other instruments as well, sort of extended techniques. And it really offers and opens up the sound of the guitar in, at least in this context, in very different ways. One of the early conversations that Alfredo brought to the table was kind of, and I think he sort of touched on this, that the guitar is entering really into the territory of the flute. At times you may even hear the guitar and think it's the flute, just because we're very accustomed to these long tones and sustaining gestures and vibrato and a lot of the similar types of musical gestures that you would hear on wind instruments or sustaining instruments. So I think there is this kind of duality and imitative conversational sort of element that the guitar really has the opportunity to take on a different role. So that's I think the section you're about to play is where the EBow enters.
Yeah, and we're actually, after that we'll listen to the second movement too, where you guys imitate each other, which plays on that idea of imitation and playing back and forth even more. Is there anything you wanted to add, Mark, here from
not too much. I just that this section really reveals Alfredo's love of like American minimalism and Steve Reich in particular. And what I love about this is like you get these sort of whiffs of Vermont counterpoint in the flute writing. This sort of layered, really sort of like beautiful activity going on, but then all that is to create sort of a backdrop for the solo guitar, which is actually a really cool way of orchestrating it.
Yeah, I agree. It's great texture. Okay, we're going to listen to now. It's going to start a little bit before this, so there might be a little bit of repeated notes from the guitar, but you'll hear first the flute loop, which is this dark line here continuing, and then you'll hear the guitar with the EBow come in with this sort of these slurs and stuff, legato textures. So we'll listen to this page here now. Yeah, that gives you guys a little taste. Now you'll want to go listen to the whole piece. Yeah, beautiful. I love the little bend too here down here. It's wonderful. And hearing, yeah, with the loops, what I love too is just, yeah, it's totally flipped the dynamic in my mind of having the guitar be this melodic thing and the flute's providing counterpoint through the use of loops. I think it's really ingenious. Yeah, I'm gonna just remove that screen so it's just us. We'll go to the second excerpt now, and you guys can use that as fodder to talk about. Do you have anything to add here, Alfredo, about what we just listened to? Or
I can add that I was surprised at the 3/2 time signature that I used, where I find myself sometimes writing time signatures just out of a comfort and commodity to make sure that everything is organized. Yet I can't really hear the 3/2 time, except for in the loop part. But I think Mark and Adrian did such a great job at playing within that 3/2, but nothing that they play really sounds like a 3/2 type of feel to me. So yeah, it's just playing against what meter is and what rhythm is. So yeah, I just looking at that score for that little while, it was just like, oh, that's in 3/2. Would have never known.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, our ears organize things in different ways, right? I mean, we'll get to it when we look at the piece that you wrote for Nathan and I too. But there's some times when I listen to that and I'm like, was that the time signature I was playing? It just, yeah, especially when it comes. Yeah. Anyhow,
I could also just really quickly add that because you're going to put the second movement on top or on the screen, that there's a quote, and that quote is an Albert Camus quote. And I think everybody was reading Camus when the pandemic started. Everybody read The Plague or whatever. So I
think I read La Peste right before it started.
So I also read Happy Death. And it's a wonderful book and it's a wonderful story, but I decided to include two quotes from Camus's Happy Death in Discord, which really deal with the subject of absurdity and the main character's relationship with the world and life. So the second quote, the one that's included in the second movement, is rather musical in the choice of words, and it has to do with the character's sort of learning how to live out his life without imposing himself onto it. But rather finding a balance between his will and the burden of the human condition. So these are kind of things that are kind of heady, and I really am interested in how some of these things might sound or translate into music. And I found the quote fitting as the piece kind of is my attitude towards composition, where I create and then sort of let it go. And that while I try to write, I bend to what I feel is the will of the piece. So sometimes Adrian and Mark were so generous in giving me a great demo really quickly after my first draft. And they were generous enough to give me time to rework that because I felt like the piece could go into different directions. So anyway, I just thought I would talk about the quote because we
can read it quickly too before we listen. Also, I saw Tim Beatty said in the comments, sounds great. Very Vermont Counterpoint meets Steve Mackey. Looking forward to hearing the whole album. Thanks, Tim.
I love Steve Mackey. Yeah.
And Tim, you're on Facebook, so it wasn't able to paste the link there, but there is, if you go to my YouTube and go to the video on YouTube, there's a link to the Spotify and Bandcamp of the album. So you can find, if you go to YouTube, the link there. Or actually, I can post it on Facebook quick while we're listening to the next one, but let's add the next one to the screen here. Good. The audio is muted. Okay. This is the quote you're talking about, right, Alfredo, at the top here?
That's right.
Yeah. So what mattered was to humble himself, to organize his heart to match the rhythm of the days, instead of submitting their rhythm to the curve of human hopes. Yeah, that's very common. Nice. That's beautiful. So do any of the three of you want to add anything about what we're seeing on screen here?
I could just talk really quickly about the score itself, where it was really hard to try and come up with a notation that would work for music that was recorded in that moment and then that was going to be played back. But what was going to be played back has a completely different sort of duration. So I used a little bit of combined spatial notation, and there's little ticks on the score just to sort of refer to measures, but not really think of this as measured music. So it's really kind of a loose interpretation. The rhythm should just be almost like localized phrase by phrase or gesture by gesture rather than as a whole.
Yeah, this is also something we'll see in the piece that you wrote for Nathan and I too. And while we weren't aware of that, not being allowed to see each other's parts, which get to as well. It has some of that stuff too, where it's almost, I don't know, semi-aleatoric or something.
Right.
Yeah, like you're kind of aware of time, but not entirely aware of time, which I guess ties into the theme of time and distance of the album as well. And you have some suggested effects here: clean sound, no compression, use a volume pedal. Okay, how did you interpret the suggested effects stuff, Adrian? With or is this for guitar and flute, or is it just for the guitar, this part?
I think it's for guitar.
Yeah, I think that part's for the guitar. Well, working with so many composers, and in the past also a lot of non-guitarist composers, often they approach you with a more kind of generalized idea of the sort of sound they want. So, our job as performers is often to kind of display different options, or even just kind of, assume a certain sound effect based on, a general musical concept. In many cases, they may have a general idea of the types of effects, in which case, you sort of say, okay, well, there's this or whatever. In the case of working with Alfredo, obviously, he's a wonderful guitarist, and he has also a great grasp over the technological aspect of, recording, also how the guitar can be manipulated in different settings. Obviously, when playing with a band is very different than playing as a soloist, or playing in sort of chamber music that references rock music. So actually, throughout the piece, I really tried my best to be as faithful as I could to his suggested effects, because I think it actually opened the door into what I wanted to achieve musically. In some cases, sort of the chorus effects kind of give a more sparkling, kind of brilliant, kind of textural, edge to the guitar. And the types of overdrive in certain sections give, again, just that little bit more boost and a little bit more kind of forward presence. And other things like, the octave effects and the flute, those were very, very fun to play with in the mixing process of the piece as well, where again, you kind of, your ear could almost kind of think that it was like an electric bass, or, something also very alien but familiar. I can hear the sound of the effect, but I'd never heard a flute going through, a bass octave pedal, for example. So through each section, tracking the piece, I was really trying to, patch in effects as written. And I think for the most part, I grabbed all of the suggested effects. So reverb, delay, flangers, the choruses, overdrives, all that kind of stuff. Because again, I know Alfredo has a very clear picture of the type of sound he wants. So I did my best to try to replicate that.
Yeah, awesome. And the other thing too is that this segment we're going to listen to, as you can see here, the flute starts with this kind of these displaced notes, and the guitar is doing these bends and sort of glides down through the bends, and then they flip, and the flute has to imitate the guitar, and the guitar has to imitate the flute. How was it for you, Mark, having to imitate the electric guitar in this case and this one? Was there anything special, or was it pretty straightforward to get a similar sound?
I kind of got the better end of the deal as far as it goes, because I think Adrian and I made this. We made a deal early on that I would record my parts, and then Adrian would actually refer to what I recorded and sort of
okay,
and then follow suit. So Adrian was stuck with my rubato choices, more or less.
Nice.
But, yeah.
That's good. We did not have that luxury because Alfredo forbid us from seeing or hearing each other's parts as part of the experiment, but that's great. Because the first time I listened to it, I don't think I clocked that at this part the flute was playing these notes for some reason. I just haven't heard a flute play in this way before. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about this piece on the album, I feel, is that even as someone familiar with both the guitar and the flute, having played with flutists myself, it's still like there's so many fresh sounds to hear and so many things to discover just sonically, in terms of how these instruments come across. So does anyone want to add anything more before we listen to this excerpt?
I just want to, for me, it's just such a almost violent departure from the first movement. I feel Alfredo really goes in a completely different direction here, whereas the first movement is so focused on pulse, and this one is so expressive, and it's so gestural, and it's almost a bit of a shocking change, which I really like. It keeps reminding me of the Rite of Spring, where the first movement is sort of encapsulated its own little world, and then the second movement just goes in a completely different direction, but it's so it's so convincing and so seductive. What it is that it takes you along for the ride. So
yeah, definitely, I agree. Yeah, cool. Also, I see Ben says hi. Hi, Ben. Nice to see you in the chat. Sorry, just have to acknowledge Ben because he's always in these live streams. It's good. Okay, let's listen to this excerpt. Activate audio. Okay, here we go. Nice. Wonderful. Wow, it's amazing how closely you guys match each other. I mean, I guess that comes as playing in a duo for some time. You know, you start to really know how to play off the other person, and yeah, you know their sound. Great. It's been such a pleasure having you two on here. I wanted to give you both a chance to say any final things you want to say about the piece or about the album as a whole.
Well, I'll just say, just touching back on that last movement, actually, thank you for both for playing the piece and for your very kind comments, Michael. You know, I remember recording that movement actually, and as Mark said, it is such a departure from the first. And I think it kind of thinking like in the first movement when we're recording it, editing it, also like really trying to make sure that everything was vertically aligned, you know, as for the style, and that all the loops were fitting correctly, and that there was this kind of, you know, mechanical sort of at times rhythmic interlocking. And I remember being very concerned about the gestures in the second piece, whether, you know, they were exactly matching. I had this idea that, you know, we had to be kind of like aligned. And as Mark said, I was sort of referencing his initial recording to try to imitate and do my best to really try to align the gestures in the same rubato and kind of freedom of tempo. And yet there were some discrepancies, actually. You know, it doesn't entirely match up at certain points. And when I was working with Alfredo, it seemed to be sort of what he was after, you know, and I think talking with him sort of freed me up a little bit as to understanding the language of that movement, and sort of like, as you mentioned, this kind of ghostly remembrance a little bit of, you know, the past, and some of the gestures that are, you know, evoking this kind of, this sort of memory of time and of distance, you know, again, with the theme of the album. But there was this period of time when I was working on the movement, I remember thinking like, I don't know if I'm really getting this, you know, I wasn't convinced of my own interpretation, or in sort of, you know, presenting it to the composer was kind of very worrisome for me. So, you know, I was very happy to get his approval, and that, you know, I was kind of at least going down the right path. And actually, when we were talking, it sort of gave me this aha moment, like, oh, okay, I get it now. You know, like actually, I can understand what he's going for. So,
sorry, I'm just smiling because Nathan and I, especially with not being allowed to see each other's pros, we both kind of were in that headspace, and we were both kind of stressed out about it, I think. But the thing is, Alfredo, of course, was nothing but positive as soon as he got our parts. But when you're like, I know even in the case of seeing each other's parts, it's like, it's a piece that, I mean, you're right, you don't really understand it until it all comes together, right? But that moment of sort of getting it and realizing that it actually worked is always a relief. So I can relate a little bit. That's good.
You know, it's funny in this particular movement too, that I think that I left a little bit there to be performed live, because in a live situation, you very quickly realize, because you have the visual confirmation of a person is actually playing what it is that you're hearing. So there's this sort of, you know, matching and synchronization happening. So if you have loudspeakers on stage and you have Mark and Adrian playing, once they stop playing and they loop that part and then they start playing with what just happened, I think it'll even be more clear than when you hear it as a recording. As a recording, it's successful to some degree, but I think that bit, when you see it live, I think it's going to be pretty cool to see Mark and Adrian try to match what Mark and Adrian just did a moment ago, right? Like, so
yeah,
it is something that I kind of wanted to leave for the live experience to still be, I think it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, Mark, did you have anything to add as well about the piece as a whole?
I just have a lot of gratitude more than anything else. I think, you know, as Alfredo mentioned, it was written in the early part of the pandemic, and Adrian and I we had made this sort of deal with ourselves, as like, we're going to be in each other's bubbles because, for mental health reasons, and because, we wanted to keep playing together. And the fact that we had this piece that wasn't just a commission, but like was so, Alfredo took such care with the piece and really wanted to explore certain aspects of it and really pushing us in different directions as well. So it became this piece was actually a bit of a lifeline for me, when we were working on it. So, and it's really kind of magical to hear how, like, this sort of world that he sculpted out of it. So, I just feel it's been a great process.
Nice. Yeah. I can relate as well. I think everyone who had a composer to work with during the pandemic was very lucky.
Yeah.
Because without that, it's like you're sitting at home and having a recording project like this too is great. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you guys.
And also,
Thanks.
I was going to also mention that the video, Mark, you made of Alfredo's other piece for solo flute, people should really check that out. I think I'll try to post it in the chat here I'll find the link and post it in the chat for people. But the piece he wrote for solo flute is also amazing, and the video is incredible as well. So that's a video I've been going back to and listening every couple of months. So I'm very appreciative of that too, because it's been a wonderful video to check out for me as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you guys so much. I'm gonna let you go now. Thanks, a good day. Enjoy your morning over there.
Thanks
again.
Okay,
see you guys. Talk soon.
Bye.
Cheers.
Alrighty. Well, that was lovely.
It's so nice. It's so nice to catch up with them.
Yeah, it's awesome. Great. Well, our next track to cover, maybe I'll try and find the video for Not Genera. I can put it for the flute piece I was just mentioning and put it in the chat for people. But why don't you introduce Under an Orange Sky for people?
Sure.
I know there's a bit of context of when this was written and why it was written and your original concept for the piece, which it had much more a concept tied to a live performance, right? Which it's morphed a little bit into the form that it's on the album. So maybe you can just give people a quick summary timeline of that while I find this.
Yeah, of course.
This
titles are a bit of a funny thing for me, where I do come up with the titles after the pieces are halfway written, or during the writing, or after they're done. And with this particular piece, it's no exception. But the title does refer to part of the time when it was commissioned, which was 2017. The province of British Columbia was undergoing terrible wildfires. And so during a long period of time during the summer, we had to live under this kind of weird orange dome. So it's not that the piece is necessarily programmatic. And there's nothing, I don't have anything against programmatic music. I think there's great works that are very filled and rich with symbolism and references. But this piece, to me, it's not really that. The piece, as you mentioned a little bit, was that it was a site-specific commission for the 2017 ISCM World New Music Days, and it was commissioned by Redshift Music Society. And they were very generous with this commission for 18 electric guitars for a performance of a concert that was going to be done in the atrium of the Vancouver Public Library. And for anyone that has been in that building, it's this sort of like semi-arc area atrium that is enclosed, but it is also really cavernous and has a lot of reverb. And so the guitars were placed throughout the space. And I believe it was like 18 of them. Yeah, it was 18 of us. And there was this huge distance between us. So the idea of creating a piece that could work in that kind of space, that would be easy to put together, because 18 guitars schedules, it's a feat to try and like coordinate.
Yeah, that's a logistical nightmare.
It's like the amplifier and the pedal situation too was like anyway, it was an awesome concert. I actually played in it too. And
sound checking must have been interesting.
Totally. But this was one of the first instances where I was playing my own music, and I thought, oh, this is really fun. This is kind of cool, where I get to write a better piece because I'm actually part of the actual writing process. So anyway, the connection between the the wildfires and the way that we were putting this piece together, trying to spread messages and communicating through long distance or long stretches of distance between us and trying to synchronize was something that I felt gave me that vibe. And the piece has this sort of very oppressive, kind of strange, dissonant feel at times. And then it's this wall of sound. So just wanted to think a bit about, large scale and large masses of sound.
Yeah.
And yeah,
So
that's
I'm
kind of what I wrote.
gonna add an image to the screen, and we're not going to give anyone any context. And we're going to see how many people we can terrify with the first page of the score, because the first page of the score, as a player, you look at it and you're kind of like, the thing is, it looks scarier than it is, because this kind of extended technique, aleatoric stuff, is in many cases, and in this case, much easier to express yourself immediately rather than set a sequence of rhythms and pitches. But I'm just going to show people the score and see if there's any initial reactions to just the visual. So this is some of what we've got here. And now that people have seen it, would you like to sort of explain a couple of things that are happening here, Alfredo, with this score?
I think you're right that it does kind of look scary, where I don't know what to do there. Like, every electric guitar is probably different. And one of the reasons why people have a lot of electric guitars, and I often talk a lot about this because I want to keep buying electric guitars, and it's because each guitar has its own different type of build, its own different type of pickup, its own different type of configuration. And so depending on your instrument, there are things that I can do with one particular instrument that I can't do with another. And so, for instance, in guitar 4 here, which is the 4th line down, I asked the performers to rake the strings randomly between the bridge saddles and the tailpiece. Now, if you have a typical Gibson Les Paul, or like, the Rev Star that you have back there,
or this Telly,
you can't really do that.
There's nothing here. Yeah,
there's nothing there. But if you have something like this, you do have a little bit of space between the actual, bridge of the guitar and the tailpiece. So when you rake through, it creates a buzz and it creates a really cool sound. And you could also
especially with the pickups, right? Because the pickups pick that sound up differently than what you just heard just now through the mic. Like it,
absolutely, yeah. And so each instrument is different. So I wanted to get each performer, depending on their instrument, to create a sound that would be similar to that I think a lot of guitarists have sort of heard, but we have different ways of coming up with those sounds given the instrument that we are playing or that we happen to have in our hands that day. So it does look kind of scary, but I'm also very open to, it's supposed to be random pitches being performed in those sorts of rhythms, and I'm very loosey-goosey except with the actual placement of all of this, right? If you notice, it's very strict, quarter note equals 60, and 10-2. So
the
it's
other
all
thing,
seconds.
So also Jess said, "Oh right, I remember Mike's reaction." Yeah, she saw my reaction firsthand at home of getting this score and going, "I have to record this. What the heck is this?" The thing I was going to say was, like, the piece, it starts out in this sort of very improvisatory, aleatory, because if you look at like these, for example, you can see that there's a rhythm given, for example, here in guitar 3, like there's this approximate rhythm given, right? So you sort of play within that rhythm, slapping the strings with your pick, etc. And then it turns into this kind of graphic notation, which to me, I took this literally in terms of like, the more ink, quote unquote ink, the more black I saw, the more volume, and the more speed, and you can kind of, as a performer, interpret that how you will, but there is variability here in terms of like how you actually execute that. For example, here I tried approximately here to sort of stop doing that part,
right?
So that kind of thing, and then like here there's some variance in the lines, right? However, what I was going to say was the piece starts out with a lot of that stuff that's sort of very aleatoric, very improvisatory and interpretive, and this is what starts out the album, which is kind of, I think, one of the weirder moments in the whole album. But you'll find, as we look at some of the other examples of this piece in particular, that it really does become more metric, and it becomes much more uniform in texture at certain points, and I really appreciate that about the piece. It's, I think I've shown it to a few people who aren't themselves musicians per se, and some of them are like, well, when I first started listening to the piece, I was like not quite sure how I felt about this, and then once I was listening to the middle of it, I really like enjoyed how it came together. So I think it has this really special effect of kind of what's the word, conglomerating, like it's sort of it it dovetails nicely together at different points in the piece. So yeah,
I'm a huge fan of music notation. I love music notation for what it can do, and from I talk to people sometimes that even if they're not musicians, they happen to remember the way that a musical score looks. And so I did have a bit of an inclination to want to create a score that was also visually kind of interesting or different or appealing. Not because I think it's going to necessarily sound different. I could have written out all of those different gestures. And I knew that given the tempo, given the conditions of the piece, nothing was going to sound synchronized. So in a way, I kind of just did the extra step of saying, I know this is not going to sound synchronized, so I'm not going to write it like that. I'm just going to create a graphic symbol that sort of approximates my visual interpretation of what I think this sounds like. So that's kind of the reason behind that.
Let's listen to a little bit of it.
Of course.
And at the bottom here, you'll see that at some point these guitars start doing sort of tremolo, repeated picking things. So you guys will hear that when it comes in. It'll kind of come out of the texture. The other thing that is static and actually metered is these, right? Which are sort of these bent, I don't know, almost to me they feel like sort of alien transmissions from outer space kind of
absolutely
thing going on here. So
this is the version for 2 guitars though that you and I recorded. It's not the 18 guitars version. So I just wanted also to mention that.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's that it's so good to be able to go back into the studio and record this with you, because I was finally able to get the control of actually synchronizing the parts that I really wanted synchronizing and really messing up the parts that
I can imagine with the 18 guitarists in the library, like in the giant space, these were not totally synchronized, right? Like,
I mean, the recording that I received was really interesting because it's just so much reverb. It's just, again, this wall of sound. So the things that appears are sort of the high notes, but the texture was just this revolving kind of mass. So and
so just for context, people, for the album, obviously you didn't get 18 guitars to record it in a live space.
You and I
recorded about half the parts each, something like that. And we were in different countries, but I basically sent you my stuff and you expertly put it together. I also should give a quick shout out to Tosin Abasi for his Neural DSP plugin, which I used for all my tones, because who needs real amps anymore, right? I'm not a tube amp boomer. I can use digital software to achieve anything I want. You know, I'm a zoomer now, Alfredo.
My twin reverb is crying a little bit. So
yeah. It's okay. At least I did some boomer bends in this part. You know, that's like at least that was happening, I guess.
I love it.
Okay,
I love it.
Let's listen to the first little bit of this piece.
Sure.
Oh wait, I have to actually turn the audio on. Okay, one moment. Okay, now we're in business. All right, I think that's a good amount to hear there of that excerpt. Let's go on to the next bit that you provided me here. So what's going on here, Alfredo? Here we have definitely a little more rhythmic uniformity, right, in the lower 3 parts.
Yeah, the uniformity of this was because there was a pulse that eventually, like, we used stopwatches for the original performance, so everything had to be multiples of 5 sort of thing to keep better track of 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and just have everything to be more easy in multiples of that we divide time in. So the piece, I thought, given that that was the tempo, 6 tuplets are the way to do pulse that is kind of fast given that tempo. So I wanted to have these different textures, and even though I knew that we weren't going to be synchronized during the performance, I knew eventually if we recorded this down the future or down the line that this could be synchronized. So I'm glad we finally got that chance, because I mean, the recording was kind of messy, the original one, but then in a studio, I originally kind of wanted to do a 9 guitar version kind of thing, but by just working you and I together doing all of the 9 parts, you recorded, I think, 4 or 5 guitars, and I recorded the other 4.
Mhm.
We just had way more control, and I had way more mix power to make sure that some of the sounds from the upper systems didn't overwhelm the ones in the bottom. So, and I
Mhm.
think this piece needs a lot of massaging like that, because it's kind of like a studio piece, but it's also a piece that could work live. Is But I don't know. To me, in a recording environment, this is where music like this can really shine.
Yeah, for sure. So people will hear there's still some of this aleatoric, this buzzing and chirping and all this stuff going on, and then we have sort of repeated 16th notes. This here, for people who aren't aware, maybe it just means that those guitars continue playing that same texture. So you'll hear those going on, and then you'll hear the bends come back in up here. Yeah, just for people's reference. Okay, let's listen to a little bit of this as well. Yeah, there we were getting into the second page, but I couldn't help myself that those repeated
Yeah, no,
rhythmic notes sound so
yeah.
great. And I did them. I tried in the end. I decided to do them all down picking. So I was
Oh,
like
that's awesome. Yeah, yeah.
channeling
Bring
my
out
inner like
your
you
inner
know.
head field.
Yeah,
Totally.
exactly.
Yeah,
It feels
yeah.
exactly. I was like, it just something about doing an upstroke on any of those notes didn't feel appropriate, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
I think this is sort of for me, a good example of how putting restrictions and limitations of, say, this is going to be an outdoor piece where people are not going to be next to each other, and it's going to be difficult to synchronize. You
mhm.
create certain avenues or paths where you create something that is going to actually achieve something. So, by virtue of having that be the restriction, I was able to write a piece that had this type of pulse that would allow for this type of playing. And sometimes the more obstacles you have, the more able you are to create something that avoids all of those pitfalls. And it just frees up space to actually just write music rather than figure out what to write. You're trying to figure out how to write for this situation.
Yeah, isn't that a Stravinsky quote that the more limitations you put on yourself, the more creative you can be? Something along those
I
lines.
think, yeah, I think a lot of people sort of have this idea. Like, I know Lars von Trier, the director, has this as well, like with the
Hmm.
idea of obstructions or the idea of parameters, freeing up
Yeah.
all of the processing power that you would have to just avoid those issues. It just sort of forces you down a path. The duration, the instrumentation,
Hmm.
the venue, even sometimes knowing what the program is going to be in a concert can help the composer say, well, I guess I'm going to write a response to this.
Yeah, yeah,
But
for sure.
mhm.
Yeah. My dad said on Facebook or on YouTube, the sound of the guitars communicates to me the ominous nature of wildfires.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, let's check. This section is one of my favorites.
Hmm.
A, because it sounds so cool the way you put it together, especially the mixing you did on it, and B, because it was so much fun to play.
Hmm.
Because the idea here, and you can add or add something or correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is at the beginning of every measure, you were all lined up on the
Hmm.
downbeat, right? And then do not synchronize with others, meaning that you play your sequence of notes that you're given in sort of in that order, but in any length of the notes that you would like. Um,
Hmm.
which I think is just such a fun idea because every measure it resets and it synchronizes, but then every measure ends up sort of dispersing apart before it comes back together.
Hmm.
You also added some kind of effect where the next note is sometimes slightly anticipated, like a reversing effect of the
Yeah.
something like that, and it sounds so great, like in the actual recording. Is there anything you want to add here, Alfredo, before we listen to this?
Yeah, with the reverse effect, I just couldn't help myself because you're absolutely right. Every measure is basically a chord. So the harmonic rhythm is pretty monotonous in a way, right? Because you know exactly when a change is going to occur, But when you're in between those changes, things are moving at different rates, right? So it's sort of like you hear the downbeat, and then everything sort of falls apart from that downbeat. And if you have a good internal rhythm, then maybe you can anticipate where the next one is going to be. But regardless of if you know or not, you know something's going to change. But then when you're experiencing that change, the variation within that measure is so infinite in a way that
Hmm.
I kind of like knowing that it's not going to stay like this, but there's this falling apart effect that is happening every time. And with the reverse effect, I just kind of couldn't help myself because I'm in the studio and this is going to happen. And it was a bit of an accident that I left a loop on, or I left a bit of an audio file on, and I really liked kind of what it did. So I just emphasized it. So yeah,
Nice.
I should put that in the score now and change the score to reflect more like what we did in the recording. So I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought that up.
Well, yeah, I mean, as soon the studio, like recording something and using digital editing and
Hmm.
everything is just it's the black box, right? Like as soon as you
Hmm.
open it, there's no, you can't close it again.
Yeah.
Everything just like, you have an idea for manipulating something
Oh,
sonically
definitely.
or temporally, and like there's sort of no going back at some point, which is why it's just another step in the creative process, which we're going to talk about with Nathan in a moment for the duo piece as
Awesome.
well. But yeah, okay, let's listen to this this little bit. And yeah, I
Awesome.
just think this section is so great, especially because it comes off the heels of such a driving, kind of aggressive part of the piece.
Oh,
And then
right
you
on.
get here and it's just like the first chord hits and everything just sort of relaxes, and you hear the chords disperse and then come back together. It's great. Okay, let's actually listen to it instead of just hearing me talk about it. Here we go.
Mm,
Yeah, gorgeous.
nice.
Nice. One other thing I wanted to mention, I love that in this piece you use these like pop or rock chord diagram things.
Totally.
Like, I think it's great. I mean, I'm I'm all for something being easy to read. So, sometimes just knowing this is the exact like fingering you meant without
Yeah, yeah.
having to use like the numbers in the circles to signify the string that classical guitarists always use. I think it's genius.
Yeah. Well, the guitar notation system, I think, is so complicated in a way, or unlike other instruments that are traditionally more commonly known, like string writing or even trombone writing or whatever. But
Hmm.
these symbols are shortcuts, I think, for a lot of people. And I
Yeah.
think anybody can read a diagram, put their fingers like that, and
Yeah.
spell it out. I myself would have trouble just seeing this piece and figuring out how to best play that, because
Yeah,
there's
but you don't
different
come
ways
from a
of voicing
classical
that.
background, right, on guitar. Like you didn't learn notation that
Definitely
way
not.
on the
Definitely
instrument.
not.
You use notation in the rest of your practice as a musician, but not so much on the guitar, I guess. So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, the Ramones didn't notate,
Yeah.
Blitzkrieg Bop, so
learning
no.
learning punk songs in when you're a teenager in Mexico City doesn't quite it's not the same as yeah.
No. Yeah, there was
Yeah.
no tablature or notation for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The next section was this one. Actually, we're going. Oh wait, this is the last one. No, this is the last one. Okay, we'll check this one
Sure.
too quickly. We would need to bring Nathan on in a moment here to talk about the other
Awesome.
piece. But do you want to say anything about this before we listen to it?
No, let's have a listen.
Okay, nice. Here we have, yeah, that sort of driving rhythm again. This is the one I was talking about when I said that I played everything with downstrokes.
Oh,
I don't know if
definitely.
you did the same. Did you record any of these parts, or was this all me? I'm trying to remember.
I think because they're adjacent to each other, we must have alternated at least one.
Yeah,
So yeah.
interesting. Okay,
Mhm.
anyhow, let's take a listen to it. Oh, I'm a little early. It's still, this is not quite this part.
Sure.
Here we go, this part. Oh no, not yet. This
Here
section.
it comes.
Yeah, nice.
It doesn't sound like a hard piece to play. I kind of feel like somebody should put drums to that and just kind of go a little nuts on it. But,
yeah, definitely.
yeah.
It would be great with drums, I think.
Mhm,
Oh, Adam
totally.
Chickalady says, so great to see Messy Desk, loving the music. Thanks, Adam. It's great to be back. I know I've been very inactive. This is the question I asked myself. If a man does something and doesn't put it on social media, did he even do it? Does it even exist? Or a woman or anyone, you know?
Totally.
Anyways, I've still been existing, just not so much on Facebook.
I mean, I say totally, but you know, I have no social media presence or club at all. So.
Right. Fair. No, but it's honestly great to be doing the live stream again. It's really nice. I always enjoyed doing this. So
I feel like I'm hijacking it because you usually have guitarists, right? So
you're a guitarist, Alfredo.
I know, but this is a bit of the whole thing about having the imposter syndrome of being a guitarist and a composer. Like I find myself more comfortable saying I'm a composer, and then, I mean, look, you recorded this earlier. Adrian said I was like a great guitarist, so I'm just happy with that. So
yeah, well,
yeah.
You know, I don't know. A guitarist is anyone who can play anything on the guitar, honestly. So there's, you know, having some kind of hierarchy or definition is not really helpful, I think. Adam says you'll always exist vividly in my mind, whether you're on Facebook or not. That's extremely sweet, Adam. You as well. For me, you're always in my thoughts. So that's Under an Orange Sky. People can check it out on the album. Is there anything you want to mention about that piece before we move on?
No, like you said, it's the opening gambit of the album. And I think if it's the piece that I put up as a single on Bandcamp for a long time. So if people thought that was the whole album, or that's how the whole album was going to sound, they were mistaken.
Sorely mistaken.
Especially when we move into this next piece, which is the piece that I wrote for you and Nathan.
Yeah, indeed. By the way, we will talk about, I know on our itinerary we're going to talk about some of the three smaller pieces. We'll talk about those after,
yeah, of course.
just because we have Nathan waiting in the wings.
Of course,
so let's bring Nathan on. Here we go. Hello, Nathan.
Hello.
How's it going?
Hi, Nathan.
Good. I'm going to do my best not to blow my nose into the microphone.
You can just mute yourself and blow your nose when you need to. That works. Are you able to turn your gain up at all? You sound a little quiet to me. Maybe people can tell me in the audience if it's
max, but let me move this in closer. Hold on.
Okay. You just sound a tiny bit quiet. Although I don't. Yeah. If there's any balance issues, people who are listening, please tell us.
How's that?
So good, I think. And Adam says hi to you. So there you go. Yes. So we're bringing Nathan on because Nathan and I have a little duo project, ad hoc kind of duo. We live on different continents, but we still manage to do things together somehow, even through the pandemic, which has been a lot of fun. And our little duo right now, at least, is called Made in Canada Duo. So we play all new Canadian music, and we commissioned Alfredo to write us a piece. Is there anything you want to add from your perspective, Nathan, for the inception of this piece, how this came about? And
I'm trying to remember. It was so long ago. I know that we had wanted to do a project sort of focusing on distance as one of the central elements of making the piece, as opposed to something that we have to work around. It was going to be something we embraced. But I think our definition of what that was changed a lot as we went. And Alfredo really sort of got into it right away, and really encouraged us to embrace that element of it, and maybe get a little bit out of our comfort zones, which I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You really embrace the theme of distance and being in multiple places. And since a lot of our collaboration these days has to be through digital things sent back and forth, seeing as you live in Ottawa and me in the Netherlands. And until recently, international travel has been tricky. It was great. I mean, I'll speak for both of us. I mean, we have other projects we're working on over distance too, as well, with other people, and that's also awesome. But it's really nice to work, Alfredo, with you, where you had an idea of how to put it together digitally yourself, and you kind of did that closing part of the loop, let's say, which not to say that, you know, we don't like, because Nathan and I both like putting the material together ourselves as well. We're both, I think, fairly accomplished at editing and mixing and everything. But I kind of like the fact that for this piece, you know, you wrote the material, the musical material, we recorded the material and had our own sort of creative input through that, but then you put it all together, and it sort of made this nice symmetrical workflow, which I thought was really interesting as well, and made it in some ways more collaborative, because I think sometimes as a composer it must feel like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not really a composer myself, but both of you are. Maybe sometimes it feels like you sort of write the piece and then you put it out there and let the person do what they want with it, and when they record it, it's kind of like, well, I'm hands off, that's not my like, I don't have really a say in how it sounds in the end, whereas in this case you had a lot of say in how it was put together. So
that's exactly right. I mean, often you have a chance to write a piece in isolation, completely away from all manner of musician or artist or even sound at times. You know, if you don't have an instrument that you're writing for, you just rely on a lot of orchestration books, and you rely on a lot of, like, you know, pedagogical knowledge that you have. So this was a real treat to be able to, like, actually have a classical guitar in my hands, play a little bit, write it down, and then send it to you guys. And I have to say, you were very generous with me in sending me what you recorded yourselves in your home studios, which, you know, there used to be, I think, more of a distinction between what a home and what a professional studio is. But the mics that you guys were using, the equipment and the plugins that I'm trying to use and incorporate into my sound and composition workflow, they're stuff that I think is pretty pro. And I'm feeling more and more comfortable every time that I work in that medium, with somebody sending me something and being able to work with it in a way that is going to make it better in the end. So when I say that you guys were generous with it, was that you not only allowed me to edit some of the playing that you did, but also allowed me to mix it and ultimately put it out. But using your recording, I sort of matched EQ, everything that you guys did for me, and I put it together in a way that you guys sort of were okay with not being the final sort of like artist that presents this piece. And in a way, it's kind of like I was at the beginning, then you guys were in the middle, and then I kind of snuck in at the end once again, and sort of married this piece together and put it out into onto the album. So in that sense, I think it's a really different, untraditional way of working with a composer, where the composer, you know, takes what the performers do and then filters it again through my process, right? So it was great. And also that you guys, Nathan, you brought up the facet of distance. I think early on in our conversations about the piece, we discussed potentially recording in different places. Like, you guys perhaps had this idea of recording in this church, or maybe recording in this other studio, and just having a piece about places. So I really kind of latched onto that. But then, because you guys were already going to work separate from one another, I thought, well, what if I created a piece where Mike doesn't get to hear what Nathan is doing, and Nathan doesn't get to hear what Mike is doing, so that we create a piece that is completely in isolation, which is kind of how we were going to work. So you guys totally committed to that.
It was a nice, kind of like one of those, like you were talking about, adding an arbitrary limitation on yourself to push the creative process. And it's sort of very symbolic of the pandemic. You know, you don't really get to see what your friends are up to, and except when you hop into a Zoom meeting together, which thankfully Nathan and I did lots through the pandemic, which kept me kind of sane. But even I remember, I think I had 2 birthdays on Zoom with you and some other friends. Nathan, but yeah, anyhow, so it was sort of beautiful that, and sort of poetic in its own way, that we didn't get to see each other's parts at all. You blocked them out on the scores, which was quite rude. But you know, really, yeah, it was really interesting. And I think, not to say anything negative about the piece, but I think, you know, a piece like this, especially with the textures you use as a composer, Alfredo, and the way that you play with rhythm and stuff, it doesn't make a lot of sense with just one part. honestly. And I think Nathan and I both sort of privately and separately had feelings. Maybe you can confirm or deny this, Nathan, but we sort of privately had feelings of like, I'm not sure about this. I don't quite get what's going on here. And you know, Adrian said the same thing with his piece with Mark until he heard it come together. And I think that made like hearing the final thing in the end even more like satisfying for me. And I mean, Nathan can say what his perspective was, but it's just, you know, there's some sections where I was like, what the heck is going on here? And then once I heard it all together, of course, I was like, I get it now. And the fact that you wrote it in a way that even without us seeing each other's parts, it could still make sense together in the end is, I think, quite an achievement, which I think is more down to your writing than our playing, you know? So I don't know. Well, what was your perspective, Nathan, on not seeing the other part? Or
Well, I think what was interesting about it to me is that I consider myself an ensemble player primarily. I do most of my work with the Ottawa Guitar Trio. And I think when you are learning a piece, and especially when you're learning a new piece and you're learning it with everyone at the same time, you're very aware of the role that your part plays in the bigger picture. So it's like, oh, okay, yeah, here I'm supporting, here I'm leading, here I'm textural, whatever it is. And I'm looking at this piece. And one of the movements, I think it's the third movement, but it might have ended up being the second movement on the final cut. Like I'm just playing bends for pretty much the whole time. And I was like, I don't know, like, is this like, is this the lead? Is this the accompaniment? Is this the texture? So I basically had to just treat this. Oh, here come the beasts. I had to treat this like, okay, this is the focal thing. Like, how do I make this sound as good as it possibly can on its own? And I think if Mike and I had learned the piece together at the same time, I maybe wouldn't have approached some of those parts the same way. And it's not necessarily that one's better than the other, but I feel like I put more into those parts, whereas maybe if I was looking at it as a piece of the whole, I would have been like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't really need to phrase this too much. It's background or something. So it really kind of, I don't want to say forced me, but it really challenged me to take every part of the piece in my part and sort of treat it for everything that it's worth.
Yeah.
You had every right to be super skeptical about it, especially with that one. I can totally see that.
Yeah.
I trusted you. And
that movement in particular is the one with all my harmonics and sliding on one string, right? Like that, the technique I had to do was super cool. But yeah, without sort of Nathan's sort of bendy, aleatoric, improvisatory stuff above it, it's just the texture sounded kind of empty. And you know, at least when you see the other part, you can sort of be like, okay, I can see visually that this is happening over this, and this will, you know, make sense of the texture in this way. But we kind of had to trust you, which I guess is also an exercise in trusting your friends over distance, you know,
I think it's actually quite a valid question to ask, which is, what was the point of that exercise? Because now you're both aware of the piece. You're never going to be in a pre-cognizant state ever again of each other's part. In other words, you'll never be able to just look at that part and know that it's not part of this other context, right? So I guess I wanted to see if it would make a difference in the recording, and I want to believe that it did. And maybe in the future we can collaborate again in doing a recording of a different version of the piece, and we can talk about why there could be a different version of the piece. But I guess it's not to try and make things harder, but it's trying to stay engaged. And for me, that's really important, because I think even the piece itself sounds quite traditional at times. The classical guitar to me is an instrument that activates history, very much like the orchestra, right? You can't, I don't think I could write an orchestra piece without using the sound of an orchestra. I would not try to use the classical guitar and not incorporate some of the things that I think brought me to even the world of music altogether, especially being Mexican. You know, there's a lot of traditional kind of like parallel thirds moving up and down, very much like a corrido or like a trio or something like that. So I was very, very aware of the history that I was activating. And so I wanted to do something different to see if in the recording I could capture that pre-cognizant state of each of you. And I think, you know, maybe in the future when you do perform the piece together, I wonder how easy it'll be to put together, how to, now that you have the actual recording as a guide of how, oh yeah, that part sounds like this. I'm not really the soloist here, or I'm not really the main melody, but we're both doing this. I'm curious to see what would happen.
Yeah, 100%. And speaking of live versions of the piece, I'll add my screen again. And what are we looking at here, Alfredo? This is a facet of the piece we haven't really discussed yet. Why do we have a bunch of numbers in different orders? It looks like a math problem almost.
Yeah, totally. The idea was I revisited a technique that I developed in university during my doctoral work at UBC, which had to do with impermanent large scale form. So what you're looking at here, it's different arrangements of how the piece could actually be put together for each performance. So in general, the piece is a 5-movement piece. And the first movement is always going to be number 1. So you're always introduced into the piece through the same material. So the music at the beginning is always going to be the same. But what ends up happening down the line when you get to movements 2, 3, and 4, and 5 is that you can jumble those around so that 4 could be right after 1. And instead of 3 following, the sequential version, you could have 5. And instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could have 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, or whatever, all these different versions. So by using these permutations, I believe there's 24 different versions of the piece that are possible.
Looks like that from the screen, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a theory about why I did that and why sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's just another way of engaging with musical material. And in part of my study was that musical form is mostly a construct that is used as a pedagogical tool to sort of delineate and show where the limits of music are. This is the introduction, this is the chorus, this is the verse, this is the sonata allegro form, this is the exposition, this is the development, this is the recapitulation, etc. And it's sort of these like huge chunks and containers. And what I wanted to do was to create a formal arrangement in which the form, rather than being static, was an active agent of change. So I did this whole string quartet, and there's like 720 different versions of it, and it's like an hour long. So it's kind of impossible to like play more than 1 or 2 different versions of the string quartet in one concert. So anyway, so I wanted to try that again, because I think in a chamber piece with 2 musicians, you could actually
realize more versions more easily. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
Especially when Nathan and I take this on tour, we're going to have a fun time changing it every night and then being terrified because we don't know what transition's coming up.
Yeah.
The best part.
Conceptually, I think it's easier, but like it's actually, yeah.
The coolest part is that
versions,
the coolest part is that you have these over. We're going to look at now. I wanted to show people how one of these transitions works. So you have like at the end of the piece, you have sometimes, or the beginning, or sorry, the end of the movement or the beginning of the movement, you have this kind of thing where one person is getting a specific cell to play that can be repeated however many times, and the other person, you can see here, has been continuing on what they played at the end of the last movement, right? So you kind of overlay them, and depending what order you put the movements in, different parts get overlaid with each other, which obviously don't always line up rhythmically or completely harmonically, or they actually create new harmonic worlds, you could say. But yeah, actually the transition I wanted to look at first was, I think, this one, going from the yes.
All right.
Going from the 4th. Wait, I had
starting the 4th.
Starting the 2nd. This is starting the 2nd, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Going from the 4th to the 2nd, because in the recording we made, it was 1, 4, 2, 3. No, 1, 3, 4, 2, 5. That's the order we did. See, there's so many permutations, I can't even remember what order we did in the end. Yeah. So this would be starting at, wait, I had this lined up correctly, I thought, at 8 minutes and 40 seconds in. Hold up one moment. Okay, 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Got a scrub here. Okay. Yes. So I found it. So I think I was finishing. Yes, I was finishing another one of the other movements, and then Nathan plays these bends.
Right.
And then as he's playing the bends, I start with this arpeggiated thing. So basically, this is also giving people a view. Sorry, everyone, for the dead air there. This is giving a view of what Nathan and I each saw, because this was his view of this, right?
Yeah, that was Nathan's part that he was talking about. I'm sure where there's no
Yeah.
context for this kind of stuff, because it's like, okay, a bunch of dynamics and bends. You're already doing a bend on classical guitar, which, I mean, I think it's a
work for it.
Yeah, you really got to work for it. Yeah.
I think there's about, like, I don't know, about maybe a fourth on the G string that actually kind of works.
You can
and I mean
do
works.
Yeah.
I think I played pretty much everything maybe on 2 strings.
Oh,
because
okay.
you had to stay kind of around 12th fret, just because if you go too low, the strings get stiff that you can't actually get that semitone.
That's right.
The interesting thing here too was that rhythmically it was unclear. I was like, am I supposed to be really in time with this, or is it sort of just overlaid on top? So I think I kind of Mike and I had made pretty sophisticated project files in Reaper with where all the time changes and stuff were, and it was like a race against the clock. Like, can I get all these bends in before the time changes?
Yeah, I think for some movements that was essential and critical that you guys did that, because it made my life a lot easier when I was marrying the two of you. But in a movement like this one, I mean, definitely it's more aleatoric and proportional notation, like where wherever it is, that's sort of where you put it. But
I think the thing is, at the end, Nathan had more aleatoric, non-metered, quote unquote, sections than I did, and what that meant was, I think I was the one who made the Reaper files with the measures, and I made all the time changes always very clear, because I kind of needed it for myself, because I was like, well, I'm recording sort of quote unquote metered things a lot of the time, and then Nathan, but then there were places where, like, I also had that kind of aleatoric thing. So I know you did some wizardry on your end, Alfredo, at the end, in terms of probably lining things up to fit together. But yeah, it was interesting to, sort of being like, well, I have this approximate amount of space here to use to fill up with this sequence of notes. How do I make the rubato work and all that? But yeah, so this is what Nathan saw in his score, and you've blocked out my part, and then what I saw in my score was this, right?
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
I guess I could have looked up here and read pre-bend string and detuned doubts, which I didn't actually look at.
Oh,
I think you left this in, but I didn't read this, because I think my brain just sort of went, that's not my part, I'm not supposed to know. Yeah, wanted to be honest.
The interesting part about this to me is that you looked at this and interpreted and created a file so that you had a click track, and the wizardry that you're referring to really later on is just by virtue of you guys having done that, is that I was able to just line you up at the beginning, and if there was some drifting later on, there was going to be another section that you started at the same time. So it still made it seem very organic and natural. Like, the lining up was not at every measure. So I composed the piece with like enough sort of freedom, at least in this particular movement. It doesn't really matter even at all if you line up.
Yeah, and I think that kind of highlights how we were saying we really wanted the distance to be a feature of the piece. Like, I think if you knew that we were going to be learning this in the same room, you probably would have taken a much different approach.
Right.
Yeah,
definitely.
Absolutely. Let's listen to this now, this excerpt.
Sure.
I'm gonna have to flip back and forth, I guess. First, you're gonna hear me playing a segment from an earlier movement, which is represented by this black line. Then you'll hear Nathan come in with these bends, and then at some point when it switches over to my arpeggios, I'll flip the page here so you guys can hear how it sort of layers on top of each other to get between the two movements without any break. So yeah, let's give this a listen. Yep, there we go.
Nice.
Yeah, beautiful. Lovely. One other, there's two other quick things I want to show from the piece. One is this movement. So I have these two images. Again, are two different parts. So Nathan, you were given this, which is a little mysterious as well. Continue ad-libbing on rhythm, durations, and dynamics. Use a combination of artificial and natural harmonics. Did you interpret this as playing these in that specific sequence, or you just completely randomized them?
I just randomized them. And actually, I think this is one of the places where I think if we had learned this in a more traditional way, I would have done something completely different. But I'm kind of happy that I didn't, because I basically just like wrote melodies with those notes and played them. And then what was fun was I heard that Alfredo sort of was able to pick and choose what he liked to put it together. So I don't think what's on the album is like what I played there start to finish. It's sort of a reworking of it. But the material that was generated, I think it would have been affected if I knew what was going on around it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Nathan. I think maybe your gain is so high that the StreamYard is automatically bringing you down. Can you try turning it down and talk again?
Sure. How about that?
Oh no, it's too quiet now. Just put it back to what it was. You were peaking a tiny bit there, but it's okay. You're understandable.
All right.
I just thought I could maybe try. It doesn't matter.
You know, that makes a lot of sense that you interpreted that, and you would never be able to interpret it in the same way had you been working with Mike, because you would want to get out of his way, or you would want to, you know, create something that was musical. And so it goes back to the nature of what we think is musical with information or context. So
and if you were hearing me play too, it would affect things like the thing that I like in this is that it feels like we're in two completely different worlds temporally in terms of like tempo and rhythm, and that just it would be really hard to replicate that live, you know. Like I hope we can when we do it, but because okay, we'll look at my part now to see what I mean about that, because this feels, when I look at this, if I just look at this in isolation as a player, I sort of have this sense of sort of spacey, ethereal harmonics, you know, that kind of just naturally comes to my brain as a guitarist looking at this direction and these notes, right?
Yeah.
And then you look at this and you realize what these little slashes here mean, which is like tremolo kind of texture, right? As quick as possible. Yeah, and there's no tempo marking here, but I think there was one earlier, and it is quick. So I had the context of knowing this movement is supposed to sound quick. I don't think Nathan really had that context, which is kind of cool. But the thing that I love about what you did here, it looks a bit foreign even for guitars, and the first time I looked at it, I was confused at first too. But the reason that these notes change here above while there's just a slide, a glissando marking here, is because I'm playing harmonics on one string for the entire movement. And from this note until this note, I'm supposed to slide my finger along the string towards the destination, which is this harmonic, right? And what's cool about that, if you play guitar, you know that harmonics happen at specific points on the string, which is based on the division of the string. So if it's like half the string, that's the 12th fret harmonic, that's the octave. There's a harmonic at a quarter length of the string, a third length of the string, etc. So it's all these sort of fractions of the string. So as you slide your finger along the string to the next destination for the next harmonic, different harmonics are created as you go through that, which I thought was a very genius way of using. I've literally never seen this before. Maybe there's another composer who's done it, but it was very cool. It was quite a challenge to play because I'm not used to moving my hand continuously. Like when we slide, we almost always glissando or slide very quickly to the next note because we don't want to hear every fret in between. But the whole idea is to have a steady motion. So I spent the most time, I think, of the whole piece practicing these sections because I wanted to get a steady transition between the harmonics, you know.
That's so interesting because I thought like I treated it a little bit like what's the that device that people use, put it in their ring finger,
the slide,
like slide. I thought of it more as a slide guitar type of thing that you just move to a fret and you sort of like move around a little bit, like that's kind of.
But I saw that you put very specific, like dotted eighth note, like it was like the durations of the notes seem specific to me, so I thought, well, you know.
Yeah, it has this hemiola type of rhythm, like one da, 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 da. So like by moving through these different positions and going back and forth, that's why the 12/8, which kind of made me laugh when I was looking at Nathan's part, that he had that box, but it's in 12/8. You know, so you ad lib, but you have to do it in 12/8.
Yeah, which is also kind of funny,
Which
especially
makes
when
no
there's
sense.
no like lengths for the notes specified. So yeah.
But to me, it goes back to the thesis of the whole thing around impermanent large-scale form and the multivalence of parts. And multivalence meaning like something that can have multiple meanings, like the beginning, or sorry, the middle could actually be the ending of the piece, and the ending for the piece could actually be the thing that comes right after the first part. So when you have these pitches, as Nathan was talking about, like if you are given a context, that context would have already told Nathan he should play or ad lib in such a way, really without any kind of freedom. But by being able to interpret whatever information was there objectively without any kind of musical context, I think we got perhaps a truer version of the piece. And I think it goes back to the thesis of the whole thing, where I'm trying to create multiple meanings out of the same material. Like this material doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, the victory at the end of the epic that you're listening to or experiencing as you're going through the piece. It could just be the exposition of material. It could be the thing that just comes right after the beginning. So anyway, I love that. I love how there's multiple meanings to things that seemingly are the same.
Yeah, definitely. Let's give this a quick listen now. So you guys will hear, in this case, I started first. Oh, no, this is the middle of the movement already. So it's not going to be showing the transition, the layering. It's just going to be straight into it, I believe, if I wrote down the timestamp correctly. 4:16. Okay. Let's give this a listen. I can't have both things on the screen at once, but you guys get the idea. You'll hear Nathan playing some high harmonics and then me doing this stuff below. Okay, here we go. There we go. And you guys could probably hear at the end, I was muting the string just barely at the left side of it, which was kind of a cool effect as well. And one thing I really appreciate, Alfredo, was that you wrote lots of string noise and lots of nail noise at the beginning of the movement, which doing these kind of harmonics and stuff and this sliding stuff, it was a big relief, because it's like, of course, when you see that as a guitarist on the bass string, the 5th string, you're like, well, there's going to be scraping and sliding and scratching and nail noise when you're trying to play that rapidly. So it was a relief that you just wanted me to embrace that. And I actually, in the end, recorded on a guitar that is much more sensitive in terms of harmonics, because it's a double top. And I put the mics way closer than I normally would to my fingers and hands, which is normally a danger, because then you get more and more nail noise and string noise. But I thought, well, since we're leaning into that,
no, absolutely. The combination of the chokedness of the string in your part against, you know, Nathan's super like glass-like chime harmonics is awesome. Like I really like that. It's 2 different flavors of guitar strings. So
yeah, 100%. There's one more quick section I wanted to check. This was the yes, this section. Yes, this thing. Okay, I'm gonna share the screen one more time. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear. It just has some guests over, so hopefully that's not too audible. Okay, this section. So here's what would be Nathan's part, and this was my part.
This is the 5th movement, right?
Yeah, the 5th movement. Yeah, which this was also. Have you seen this before, Nathan? Where this was a new technique to me. This idea of playing 2 notes in a metered way while sliding up to another 2 notes, right? Like, have you done this before, this kind of thing?
I don't think so. No, there was lots of cool little Easter eggs like this.
Yeah. And it's over, and I also it is metered, but because of the slide and the glissando idea, it's like you don't have. I don't think we had the exact same phrasing when I had the part later in my part as well. But and then it's over this these like slurs, which also were really fun to execute, I have to say.
I mean that kind of hammer-on thing, it's more typical of electric guitar. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. Anyways, let's give this a quick listen as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is 12:45. Okay, scrubbing through. All right, let's give this a listen as well. Yeah, and the piece continues on from there.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Yeah,
no, this is
cool
one place where I'm so glad the click track was there for you guys, if you used it or not, because it lined up well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this movement I was also worried about because there was a lot of complex rhythms, and we realized after listening back that there's some phasing, which at first I didn't realize. Is it phasing, or where you have arpeggiated patterns where one changes by a 16th note and
right.
the other doesn't? And the first time I listened back, I was like, damn it didn't line up properly. But actually it sounds, once you realize that's the intended effect, it sounds really cool.
Yeah, sometimes actually not knowing what the other person is doing is actually better, right? Because then you're able to just play through without regarding what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. So anyways, those were some of with 5 movements, the piece is quite long, so people can give it a nice listen. I know there was some discussion we had about whether you were going to include 2 versions or 1 version, and what order the movement should be in for the recording. And I know that in the end you just made a judgment call based on how things lined up, right? So
that's right.
But I'm really happy with how it turned out.
I love the way it turned out, and it's, I think, one of the successful pieces of the album in that it creates this great anchor point between, it's in the middle of the album, and it's a piece that goes to my Mexican identity the most in some way. There are some uber romantic passages that I purposely wanted to include and sound like that, because I thought it was important for me to include the sound of the classical guitar as I know it, which is almost like a musical object, like a sample, if you will, where it's not necessarily a creative voice that's speaking through. It's almost like my musical ghosts of the past, like speaking to me about what it means to be a composer today in Canada, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very important piece to me. And I want to mention too that the title is created through a word generator. I used a word generator online randomly to spout out like 4 different words, and it came out with these series of words like foundation, visit, scatter, high. And I don't know, it's just like every word kind of connected with the concept of what I was envisioning for the album and what I was thinking about the piece. Foundation, where you come from, a visitation, something of a high, which is like elation, and the scatteredness too, that we're all individuals scattered throughout the 3 different cities, and the multiverse. So,
what I think is really interesting. Sorry, it's just about what you said about how you feel, how you perceive the classical guitar from your place of origin and stuff. It's interesting because I think for people from North America, like Nathan and I, maybe the classical guitar is kind of this academic, sort of thing, and we would view, I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe we would view the electric guitar more in the way that you probably saw, because if I understand it correctly, in Mexico, is this kind of guitar, like nylon string classical guitar, is played a lot more in people's homes. Absolutely. By sort of everyone. And so there were a lot of gestures in the piece that, like, to me, I was like, this is very like noodly, but in a good way, in the sense of like, it feels to me playing it and learning it that, like, okay, this is something I could come up with in the evening after having dinner and a beer and just chilling with the guitar and in the living room with someone else around, and so I thought that was really refreshing, because I'm so used to classical guitar music that's trying to take itself so seriously, not that this isn't serious music, but just it came across to me for sure, and I think that's really interesting.
I mean, it definitely was for me that type of experience where with the guitar in a social setting or in a gathering, it became sort of, oh, everybody, now we can do this activity. And I didn't grow up in a particularly religious household either, where perhaps, traditional choral singing or, that type of ritualistic community gathering type of event was important. The guitar is more of a cultural phenomenon or an artifact of culture rather than an artifact of artistic expression. So for me, it was sort of like this instrument of community building. not necessarily an instrument for, you know, expressing the soul or the individual's ideas about music. So, yeah, I think to me, like that's what the guitar did for me when I was growing up. It was this sort of instrument that gave me access to a culture rather than it gave me access to music. The piano was more of like, oh, I can play Mozart or I can play
Yeah,
Beethoven
yeah.
and, you know, Western European composers from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. The classical guitar was, hey, I could do a little bit of like whatever. I could learn a ranchera song or a little bit of Pearl Jam or maybe even just like noodle around with some I don't know, finger picking flamenco even, you know. I think the Spanish guitar for flamenco dancer and performer is completely different than what the guitar is for me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean that is, it's not that we have things perfectly this way, but that's one thing I appreciate about being a classical guitarist is I feel like the repertoire is in some ways not so stuck in one place or one time, you know, and so it kind of feels like we can get away with kind of accessing this whole other way of seeing the instrument, whereas it might be harder for some other people in other classical traditions, like certain instruments. I don't know. I don't want to speak for other instruments, of course, but yeah, it's just it's interesting.
Totally.
Yeah, is there anything that either of you want to add about the piece further? I'm also wanted to also say that I'm extremely grateful for Nathan's collaboration with me and for keeping me a part of his artistic life despite living so far away. And it was just, for me, it was such a joy to be on this journey with the two of you guys and do it together. But do either of you have anything you want to add about the piece before we wrap up?
Just a huge thanks that you were super generous with allowing me to get in there and sort of like, you know, take it over the line in a way at the end of it. And I think that kind of openness is what I look forward to in future and what I will look forward to in future projects.
Nice.
Yep.
Do you want to add anything, Nathan, or are we good here?
Just, you know, thank you, Alfredo, for taking charge and not being afraid to compromise on, you know, what the vision was, and we made it work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Likewise.
Yeah. It was a very iterative process, and it was very fun and easy. So, yeah, that's awesome.
Some parts.
Some parts are true. Yeah, true, Nathan. I think Nathan had some harder parts than me, if I'm not mistaken. After looking at both the parts, I mean, I had some bits too that took some effort to put together, but yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, the first one, Nathan's part in the first one looked intense, but it sounds really great. I mean, I'm very impressed by your playing in that, Nathan. But I think that whole movement, I just had like fun arpeggios, and then you had like this crazy like lead line. So yeah, it's great. My dad says, as a non-musician, after listening to you musicians discuss your collaborative work, I have a greater appreciation for your talents and skills. Thank you, Dale. Thanks for being here to listen. Yeah, that's lovely. Okay. We are going to let you go, Nathan, and try to recover from your cold and silence. Sorry for forcing you to speak.
No worries. All right, good to see you guys.
Yeah,
right,
it looks
take
like
care, Nathan. Feel better.
Buddy might need a meal as well. I know he's there with you.
Yeah.
Or is he sleeping now? Okay. Well, anyways. Hi, Buddy. Okay. We'll see you, Nathan. Thanks for joining us.
Yep. Bye.
Ciao. Okay, Alfredo, you got me for another 15 or 20 minutes. So
awesome.
What do you want? Which piece do you want to talk about? Maybe we can go over some of the smaller. I know we have electric counterpoint to deal with as well, but electric counterpoint is maybe the piece that people already know the most about out in the world. So maybe we can.
Yeah, we can talk about the other three sort of pieces that I think are. It's smart of you to combine them, actually.
Yeah, because so far what people have heard through this live stream has been all these collaborative pieces, waiver mode.
Right.
Under an Orange Sky, I know wasn't initially viewed that way, but in the end, it was kind of a collaboration between you and me in some ways. And then the piece with Nathan. There are three shorter pieces that sort of spread throughout the album, which are kind of featuring you more as a player, but also featuring you as a player in different contexts, and I found that really interesting. I put them in a specific order. I think the order I have is good, and maybe we can just touch on each one, and you can tell people what you think of it and how it came across. Ben says, love all the collaboration involved in this project and great conversation going on. Thank you, Ben, and feel better soon, Nathan. Indeed. So the first one was Drowning Bulls. This is a pretty personal piece. Actually, two of these in particular seem very personal to you. Do you want to give people a bit of context for Drowning Bulls?
Sure. One of the reasons why I mentioned that it's smart to put them together, or these three pieces, is because you're right. Like electric counterpoint is 15 minutes, wave remote is like 12 minutes, and your piece with Nathan ended up being like 14 and a half to 15 minutes. So these sort of like this trio of pieces scattered in the album are kind of like the miniatures, so to speak, of this larger type of album. And the first piece that you mentioned, Drowning Bulls, is a performance of me of this one little riff that I came up with back in 1999 using a guitar that I no longer have, and parts of it also using a guitar that I still have. So I used to play in a band in Missouri, and for years I sort of played electric guitar, and I had it with me as I was learning music, and classical music for that matter. So I came up with this little riff and put it together in a 4-track cassette player, which is right now completely obsolete technology, but I was able to just loop it and play against myself. And to me, that was like this huge accomplishment,
revolutionary thing. Yeah,
super revolutionary. So I transferred the tape to digital back in 2005, and then I just reworked it 3 months ago with even more samples and solos. And to me, it made sense to include the piece as a part of an album that dealt with time and distance, as a way of incorporating a part of myself that I actually still have. I think owning these sort of tapes that I have of me playing piano or me playing guitar, it's kind of like having a picture of yourself from when you were that age. But a recording is a little bit more, I think it's a little bit more special, because especially because you think a lot of things when you hear yourself play in the past, where I thought I thought I was a great pianist, but then you hear yourself and you're like, wow, I'm so sorry to all my piano teachers.
Yeah, but sometimes, okay, but to be fair, sometimes you listen back and you're like, wow, I thought this was so terrible at the time, how this went in this video.
Yeah.
Like I watched back some of my old YouTube videos of like stuff from my like recitals through school and stuff, and I'm like, I was so worried that this was terrible, and then I listened back, I'm like, I was doing pretty good for where I was at that moment, like.
Yeah, it's the inverse is the same too, where even though it's not great, I can definitely not do that anymore. So I was definitely in good shape. So anyway, so Drowning Bulls was just like a clever name for what I thought the repeated type of loop was, and it's just a short type of moody ambient electronic piece with that same guitar riff and with some noodling and soloing on top of it,
and some recorded material of Alfredo in the distant past.
That's
very
right.
apt for an album about time and distance. Nice. Okay, let's listen to, if I just play the first part of it, we'll hear the guitar riff, right? Like it's right away in there. Yeah, okay. Let's listen to like a minute of it. I'm gonna add it in now. This should work here.
It's very soundscapey.
Yeah. I love how you have it sort of sound very distant and radio-like in the intro, and then all the whole texture and this sort of like wet, rich texture just sort of floods in with the riff again. And then the riff is sort of, I assume that second version of the riff is a little bit updated in terms of quality. And
the thing that I feel the most when I listen to that piece is how soothing it was. Like, I don't know why I came up with this like 2-chord thing, and sometimes just like a chord that departs and comes back. The whole of Western classical music, I think, is based on the dominant and the tonic. So it's kind of a similar concept. It's just like in a smaller scale. And I don't know why, I just found it very soothing, and I still find it to be soothing when I hear those 2 chords. I have a really high tolerance for music that is repetitive and music that doesn't really do much, or seemingly doesn't do much.
Yeah.
Kind of, but it's more like music that has different rhythms and different layers, because then I can sort of jump from one place to the other of musical stream. So yeah,
cool. Nice, beautiful. The second piece I want to talk about, the second of the
Mm-hmm.
small pieces, is El Nacional,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not mispronouncing that.
No.
This one also seems pretty personal and maybe slightly political in some ways. Do you want to give people a general overview of this piece and how it came about?
Yeah, so similar to Drowning Bulls and in Under an Orange Sky, I was playing around with a new Gretsch guitar that I had in that space that I really like between the bridge and the tailpiece.
Yeah.
And I was just messing around with this Bixby bridge, and I created this sort of loop and then started soloing on top of it. And I sort of heard faintly in some of the things that I was playing this rendition of the Mexican national anthem, or the first triad, or the first few notes. And I don't know, I just felt kind of not not angry necessarily that I was like playing this on top of that, or that that even came about in some sort of improvisation. But there's no escaping nationality or where you come from. And as an immigrant in Canada, it's taken me, I think, a little bit of a long time to come to terms with my Mexicanness and what that actually means. I left quite young, and I still have a lot of reservations about the stuff that is going down in Mexico with its leaders and with the government in power. So I guess it's all music to me is political in some way or another, because it is saying something about the condition of the person that is performing it or writing. And ultimately, by virtue of being who you are, I think that there is political stance, regardless of whether you're trying to or not being political. But yeah, so it it's also it's also like a double layered of meaning for me, where it's definitely not a solo like a Joe Satriani or a Steve Vai type of thing, and not none of it in this album I think is. But I don't think music needs to be virtuosic in that way. But I found myself playing this, and I don't know, I just found it to be kind of charming is a weird word, but I was kind of charmed by the fact that this came out and not something other than the national Mexican anthem.
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, I mean, not to draw a direct comparison per se
Yeah.
in terms of how or why it was played, but you know, Jimi Hendrix's version of the national anthem is not loved because it's virtuosic. So
Yeah,
you don't
totally.
it doesn't have to be virtuosic to make an artistic impact, right? And not that I'm saying that his version is not virtuosic. I mean, Jimi Hendrix is obviously an amazing virtuoso, but like, yeah, you're in good company in terms of reinterpreting the national anthem in some way, and putting
Yeah,
your own emotions and feelings into it at the time. And yeah, I mean,
yeah,
of
and
course.
national anthems are such powerful pieces of music, and it's the perfect example of how things can be appropriate and inappropriate with like protest and what some people may feel or may not feel. I happen to think that national anthems are a canvas that people should actually, continue to, discuss personal affectations of their conditions on the national anthem. So, yeah, maybe I should do an O Canada version.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. 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 Interesting. Okay, well, let's listen to El
Sure.
Nacional. Let me pull it up here. And yeah, I was also going to draw attention to the sonic similarity to Under an Orange Sky, because as soon as I heard the opening part, I was like, oh, this is the same thing that we're doing and that I was made to do in Under an Orange Sky, So, okay, let's listen here to this. We'll listen to like, I don't know, the first minute or so.
Sure. Mm.
Nice. I just wanted to wait till at least the
Totally.
the lead part came in.
What
Yeah.
I think the point of it to me is that, like, it sounds a little pathetic and it sounds a little pithy,
Yeah.
and it weakens sort of like the nationalism that is sometimes used for this like emboldened type of a song,
Mhm.
which is it's often referred to as a martial type of sound for the Mexican
Right.
national anthem.
Which is
So
kind of nice
yeah,
to satirize that if that's something that maybe you don't identify with, this idea of strong nationalism, right? Is that you can
totally.
sort of turn it on its head. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's something that I'm still struggling with Mexicanness and what that actually means, because I also have this added benefit of not seeming sometimes like I'm a white
Like
Mexican in
stereotypically Mexican.
Canada.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and sometimes I feel like, well, I kind of wish that I could, so that I would also have access to the things that sometimes I think a lot of people afford. You know,
Mhm.
so yeah, it's a complicated discussion around identity
Mhm.
and what
Yeah.
identity means. So
Well, and nobody can fully fit into the box of what it means, what it's supposed to mean to be their nationality, you know. And of course,
mhm.
like everybody has different perceptions about what your nationality is. As a Canadian in the Netherlands, you know, people have a certain perspective of
Yeah.
what Canada is here, which is often like extreme rose tinted glasses, you know, like I get
Oh yeah.
treated as if like, well, why would you ever leave Canada to come to the Netherlands? And it's like, well, you don't
Yeah.
understand, like Canada's not perfect. I mean, it's like, I love being Canadian, but like,
Mhm.
yeah, sometimes I think Canada's PR is far better than it ought to be. So,
Yeah.
you know, but it was just funny
100%.
because, you know, you meet people and you're like, well, yeah, and also, yeah, there's things that like I don't fit as well in Canada
Mhm.
in some ways as I do here in certain cultural things. So it's just,
Yeah.
it's always weird to have this expectation of how you should be when you're somewhere new.
But I
Which,
think you have this as well, where it's this sort of sense of permanent nostalgia or permanent longing to fully have your identity match your geography. And
yeah,
I've never really had that in my adult life by choice, but it's a choice that I'm not willing to compromise on, because I obviously want to live where I find myself to be the most comfortable and able to express myself, given all the different, political problems of Canada. But at the same time, I also never experienced what it's like to live in a place where both your identity with your mother language matches the place where you are. So yeah.
yeah, and I guess it's also strange for me too because I don't have this feeling of feeling unmoored per se, partially because I
Mhm.
grew up overseas when I was a child in Indonesia for
Right.
10 years. So like I kind of don't have this experience. Like I know some people who move and then they feel immediately unmoored and like they have to deal with all this like,
Oh yeah.
you know, difficulty with their identity about it. And it's like, yeah, there's difficult things about it for me. Maybe it's also just my
Mhm.
personality, but
Yeah.
because
It's
since a young age, I mean, you have also been moving around since a young age, right? So
yeah.
maybe you have some of the similar experience where it's like, well, I'm so used to this now that it would feel weird to feel like I fit in
Mhm.
national, or I identify both nationally with where I live at the same time. I don't know.
Yeah.
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 Anyhow.
No, we've had these conversations before around, like, belonging and what it actually means to be of a place. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's this I think it's just an ongoing kind of uh perception that I continue
Yeah.
to have to adapt to. And I think the adaptability that I had when I was young, moving around in different places, was both an advantage because it got me farther in different ways, without
Hmm.
necessarily being limited by what the perception of somebody was of me. But I also
Hmm.
was giving up something of myself by moving so quickly away, in almost like a rejection of where I came from, right? So,
Hmm. Yeah, it's
yeah.
complicated, but yeah, also human beings are complicated, right? Like that's the other kind of on the base of it sort of like stupid thing
Yeah.
of tying a place to how humans should be, because obviously we're very
Mhm.
complex and no population is a monolith and no place is a monolith. So
Yeah,
as soon as you start to try to like confine people in how they should be based on their place of origin, it kind of falls apart once you start looking at it. So, but yeah,
definitely.
very interesting way to explore it on this piece. The next one I wanted to talk about is where else quickly.
Mhm.
So, what do you have to say about this? This is with your band, your
Ah,
current band,
yeah, that's right. I've
since
been
you're
playing
a
with this.
composer by day, rock star by night. You know, so
Yeah, whatever that means. But I've been playing with this local avant rock band, uh, named Square, and for the last 3 years, I've been in this band playing guitar, and it's been so much fun to just go into a room and, like I was mentioning before, I have a high tolerance for repetition. I also find myself having a really high tolerance for things that are very loud, because it's so much fun to just sort of lose yourself into this idea of music making with a group of people. And it is just so rewarding to understand that somebody's playing in one time signature, someone's sort of riffing on this other part about that time signature, and you're living sort of through entrainment to the other musicians, sort of like living interlocking with different rhythms. So I don't know, it's just been like a community music making is a very, very special thing. I'm lucky enough to have it at home too with my partner. I have a duet. We write songs together, and we put out an album as well. So that kind of combination of writing music with people, as well as having a career as a composer, has been, I don't know, such a lifesaver the last 3 years.
For sure. There is a little visual thing I want to show for this one. So this
Sure.
is interesting rhythmically, obviously, the piano and the drums. Do you want to tell people a little bit what's going on here before we listen to it quickly?
I think in this part, the track is focusing on different rhythmic layers that are established by the instrumentation of the track. So there's a piano loop that is going in this like upward motion, as indicated by the quintuplets there. And the drums, or the rhythm, is this very strict 4-beat per bar type of a thing. So polyrhythm is sort of what's happening. And there's a composite rhythm that occurs when you have these two streams of pulses happening simultaneously. So I find myself to really enjoy situations in which I can jump back and forth between different rhythms. And it's a little bit kind of like a visual illusion, where you can see one object in one way, or you can see a different one. There's a duck and a rabbit, or an old lady, young lady type of visual sort of graphics that sort of
your
have this
mind is
phenomenon.
perceiving two things at the same time.
Yeah, and in music, I think it's the only different than in visual where you can actually be in both. There's this third composite thing that actually occurs when you're exploring this. So that's sort of the thing that I wanted to emphasize in the piece. And I just took one riff from one of our pieces, or one section of music in one of my pieces, and I just sort of played with it. And the band was gracious enough to let me sort of, muck around with it. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. And I wanted to say too, like this is probably true throughout the whole album, but it definitely gives me some like Kid A. Oh wait, we lost it. One moment. Some definitely gives me some Kid A late Radiohead, mid Radiohead kind of vibes.
Yeah, totally.
Which I hope you take that as a compliment. It's meant this one.
I mean, in the band version, it definitely doesn't sound like that. I probably just emphasize that more because that's where I like to live. When I perform, like I want people to be doing their thing, and I want to be doing my thing, and together we're sort of creating this third thing. So it's that's kind of, you're right. It's very In Rainbows, or some kind of like Weird Fishes type of riff.
Amnesiac kind of, yeah, definitely. Okay, let's give this a quick listen here. Just the opening parts.
Sure.
Oh, it skipped ahead. One second. One more time. I'll skip ahead a couple seconds to where this comes in. Here we go.
Yeah, there's a lot of looping and sampling of the voices as well. That I just love playing around with, like the different technology that you can use in home studio. But I was right now listening a lot to the 6 and the 4 of the piano. I said they are in quintuplets, but
but I hear it in 6 and 4. I hear da 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 da.
Yeah, totally. I hear 6 and 4 in a way that, is it 6 against 4 where you have this polyrhythm of like 3-2 and 3-4, or is it actually the 6, or sorry, the 8 against the 10? I love all these different streams of rhythm.
very much listening to Meshuggah without 50-year-old Swedish guys screaming into a mic. So you know,
Totally.
yeah, that's great. Awesome. Great. Okay. Well, the last piece to talk about, we're going a little over time now anyways, but is electric counterpoint. I mean, maybe we can just talk about it verbally a little bit, unless you really want to play one of the specific clips. But I mean, one of the things I was going to bring up about this before we wrap up about the album as a whole is just that this is probably the piece with the most baggage historically, and not so much in the sense of some topics that could be talked about, but more in the sense of like, normally when you record something in the classical music space, you're worried about like, well, this piece has been played thousands of times. There's all these great versions out there, and what do I have to add, etc. On the album as a whole, you don't really have that issue because so much of it's new music that you've composed, which is refreshing as a player as well, playing music that's never been performed or recorded before. But this piece has been performed and recorded a lot. So how is your relationship to the piece going into it?
It's similar to what you said, where there's this tradition of this piece that has been performed multiple times. And I don't know if you experience this as a performer, where you play to your strengths in some way. And I happen to like pulse, and I happen to like, polyrhythms, and I happen to like things that have repetition in them. So I'm comfortable in that musical environment. So I decided to learn electric counterpoint after listening to a few versions of the piece that I didn't really like that were out there. There's this piece kind of suffers, I think, sometimes from its inception, where Pat Metheny wrote the quintessential version of this piece, and it won the Grammy for best engineering, best piece, all these things. And I think people have been kind of loving
imitating
this piece since. But yeah, there's been a lot of imitation, or a lot of just focusing on what he did. And I guess people that play the Goldberg variations and listen to Glenn Gould, it could be like a similar thing, where I know certain performers that say, I'm not going to listen to Glenn Gould, I'm just going to do my own thing.
Yeah, this is a hard thing. I mean, I try to almost force my students sometimes not to listen to YouTube videos or recordings, even of great players playing the pieces that I give them, because I'm like, you're trying to become an artist here, so you should be looking at what the composer said first, and not even necessarily doing exactly what they said in every single way, because the material is now yours to work with. As blasphemous as that might sound to a composer, I'm sorry, but but the last thing you want to be doing, in my mind, is kind of just mimicking another performer, right? That being said, of course, there's something to be said for finding inspiration in someone else's rendition and all that. But like when I learned Shadow Prism by Jason Noble, other great Canadian content that Steve Cowan had commissioned, Steve's recording is very seminal. And I sort of had to put it away and not listen to it for 6 months before I started learning the piece, because I was like, that's how much time I felt my brain needed to reset before trying to learn the piece myself, because I just didn't want to yeah. So that's definitely a thing that's hard to manage. I love the mix you have for the electric counterpoint, the Reich. I love that it sounds it's very unique. I've heard a lot of versions of this piece, and it has a unique sparkle to it. The bass tone you got in the last movement. There's so many things about it that just really hit well for me.
I did a couple of versions of the piece where, when I first started recording, I kind of screwed up by switching picks in the middle of a movement, and it's just amazing how quickly you can ruin a recording by just switching picks. So I decided to do everything with one guitar, and I used my Gretsch Falcon that I love the sound of it, and it plays just amazingly in that piece. I think it's a bit of a brighter type of version of electric counterpoint, and I don't mind that type of EQ. I think that Pat Metheny really kind of put it into the jazz sound and that sound world.
The sort of warm, reverby,
totally. But also learning a little bit more about the piece and knowing some of its origins, I was really happy to take it into a direction where it's the Pat Metheny version no longer kind of had a hold over my creative choices over the piece, neither for the performance or even for the composer. So I was super glad to not just learn the piece, but be able to play with myself as the soloist does in the piece. It's such a fun thing to do.
Yeah. Do you want to mention anything more about the piece, or shall we move on to final wrap about the album?
No, I think that I have a note on the website and the album about some of the ongoing research that has been developing recently around scholarship that has found some of the original material of the Steve Reich piece or of our electric counterpoint and relating it back to the Bandalinda people of the Central Republic of Africa. And it's amazing research because to me, it just dislodges the piece from this Western European musical context that Steve Reich himself has done a lot of work in sort of like focusing on how this comes from polyphony and this phase music itself is sort of like canon on the unison, but then to hear some of the recordings that were made back in the 60s and 70s of some of these horn ensemble pieces in the Central Republic of Africa, I was just in awe of how this type of music exists without the context that I was aware of. So anybody that loves this piece, I think, should listen and take a look at some of these recordings because they're pretty amazing.
Yeah, you showed me a couple, and what struck me is that like this sort of phase music and stuff, this was kind of in some ways, like you say, a bit of a revolution in Western art music, whatever that's supposed to mean, in classical music, right? But it's like, it's when you try and get players like me myself, when I played Nagoya guitars, Nagoya marimba for arranged for 2 guitars, it was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole the first time trying to play that, because we don't play in that way. But when you listen to these recordings, you realize that there's like this social ritual aspect to this music that I don't fully understand myself, but you hear that it's like just something that these people are doing obviously a lot, and it's sort of happening organically. And it's interesting to know that there's this other context for it culturally where it started.
Oh, totally.
And that it's, and now, now it's changed the face of minimalism and modern classical music. But
I mean, part of the enjoyment of the piece for me is the pleasure that I get from living within the piece. And of all music, I think that's true of if you don't have or derive any kind of pleasure from the music that you're listening to, I think you're less likely to have that kind of music in your life, period. People go back to the things that, are soothing and give them some kind of joy. So to better understand some of the rituals behind, rites of passage or significant historical milestones of the communities that create this type of music is very different than what I thought us, like, the downtown New York scene of the 1980s. It's a completely different creative impulse. So I love knowing a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. It's great that people are doing that scholarship and bringing that stuff to light. It's good to be aware of cultural roots for things. And so that's a good tip for people to go check that out. And we won't play the electric counterpoint you're recording right now. It was played during the countdown for the stream, but people there's links to listen to the whole album on Spotify and also to purchase it on Bandcamp in the video descriptions. So please check those out. Before we wrap up here, Alfredo, do you have final thoughts on the album as a whole, coming back to the main themes, time, distance?
I think when you said, you like send me some notes for the pieces and stuff, I was just sort of jotting things down that I wanted to talk about each piece. And I wrote a line that said, maybe time plus distance equals identity. And I still think about that because I don't know if that's true, first of all, and I don't know exactly what that means, but it seems to ring true, where I do think that after, like, I look forward to in a year from now, listening to the album again, listening to the pieces in the album. And I think I'm going to get what I experienced sometime when I hear my music in the past, where there's certain things I didn't know, and now I know them. And that piece, in a way, contained that ignorance. So it's kind of listening to a different version of who you are, and sometimes listening to a far wiser person than you used to be. So I'm very grateful to be able to like put something out there, have people have attention to it, and you guys have all been amazing collaborators. I don't know if it was like Dale that mentioned this, but like the more people you put together and have some sort of like collaboration going that suits everybody's needs, and I do think that somebody has to not necessarily lead the project, but I think everybody was working with me in a compartmentalized type of way, and I really thrive in those types of compartments, right? Because when we were doing our piece, I was also doing the electric counterpoint, And when I was doing Wave Remote, I was also recording some stuff here on playing with the band that it's just all these different compartments that are brought together in the album. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah. It's a great accomplishment. I love the CD. I'm honored to be part of it. I think
Thanks so
everybody
much,
who's
Mike.
involved in it is. And I think it just achieves like it's hard. It's hard to make like a classical guitar CD that has all the same like style of writing, even the same composer sometimes cohesive, let alone a CD that spans this many different things. But thematically, it all works, and sonically, it all works. And I think you've achieved something very special. So you should be very proud of it.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I did have a lot of doubt as to how these sort of seemingly disparate genres would all fit together, and I struggled through the mastering and mixing process to make sure that everything sounded evenly, because the pieces are so wildly different, right? You have drums, you have electric guitar, classical guitar.
One of the things I wanted to mention earlier was like I really like sending you my files for our duo piece, because I mix in a very specific way, and Nathan does well. And I've listened to a lot of Nathan's recordings; he's listened to a lot of mine. But sending it off to you and having you mix our raw material and having your own take on the mixing is not what I would have done at all, but it's really nice to hear, and it's really nice to sort of give it to someone else for once and let you do the mixing, because you came up with something that has this total other sound to it. So it's really wonderful.
I mean, I had the awareness that it had to fit within an album that was also going to include electric counterpoint, right? So I wasn't haphazard about it. Like I needed to make sure that it all came out of the same speakers, or it all came out of the same mixing board, so to speak.
Yeah, and maybe listen to and hopefully in one sitting. I would encourage people to try and do that if they have the time, or they're like walking or something, But
and I think the ideal listener for it is somebody that may like two pieces, but may not otherwise choose the third or fourth option of piece in the album. But because it is in an album where two of the pieces that they like might have to listen to those other pieces, so that's kind of cool. A little bit like I don't know, like a compilation, of, I don't know, like I just hope people listen to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give everyone 2 minutes to give final questions from the audience if they have any. And what's next for you, Alfredo? What's on the horizon? Quickly before
great question. I have a couple of more talks to do around the album and a little bit more promotion in the next couple of weeks. But I have a few projects that I'm developing with the band, a few gigs that I have coming up, and I'm developing some ideas for new compositions. So, but it's been so about this for the last few months that I'm looking forward to not having something
looming
so
over
imminent.
you. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, indeed. Awesome. I'll give people one moment to add any more questions they have before I finish. Yes, I'm in the final stages of finishing recording and trying to birth this album that's quite late at this point of my own. So I understand. I'm excited to that to be done and kind of go, what can I do next artistically? It's like,
I mean, doing
nice
albums,
it's
a big chunk of your life that all of a sudden gets put together in this sort of format. And I have a lot of belief in the album as a concept, as a cultural output, something that people can choose for themselves to really experience. I mean, it's a thing, it's not just one track. It's like, 3 different commissions, 2 world premieres. Yeah,
for sure.
And to my knowledge, the first Canadian version of electric counterpoint that is commercially available. So,
and the first Canadian version of Under an Orange Sky, and the first Canadian version of, there's a lot of firsts here, Alfredo.
Yeah, that's right.
It's good. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions, but thank you to everyone who is watching. I do see there's a number in the top left there that shows me people are watching. So thank you, everyone. This has been lovely. Nice to be back live streaming a bit.
Always great chatting with you, Michael.
Yes, thank you so much, Alfredo. I will see all of you whenever I see you. Keep it cool, have fun, enjoy your Saturday wherever you are in the world. My Saturday is almost done, but I know some of you it's still like morning and stuff. So this has been lovely. All right,
thank you so much,
see
Michael.
you all later. Bye.